And good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining our seminar promoting cycling to reduce car dependency, research and advocacy for mobility transitions. I am Takemi Sugiyama. I am Professor of Healthy Cities at Swinburne University of Technology. Now, many of you know that today is World Bicycle Day, and in recognition of this day, we decided to organize a seminar in which we showcase recent evidence that can help to promote cycling. And when we were looking for people who can be part of this seminar, we were lucky enough to identify presenters from public sector and advocacy groups. So we hope that we are going to have productive, meaningful conversation today. Before I begin, my brief introduction, I recognize that I am hosting this event from the country of Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I also recognize the traditional owners of the countries where you all work today. I realize that it is a public holiday in Western Australia, so I particularly appreciate people joining from there. Well, so today's seminar is about cycling, but the ultimate goal, ultimate aim is to discuss how to reduce car dependency. We are fully aware that this is an underlying cause of many problems we face today, such as poor health, pollution, resource use, and congestion. And this is a major problem that requires urgent action, concerted efforts between researchers and advocates to influence government policies. I'd like to show you some data of travel modes from Victoria. What I did was to divide travel survey participants into quadrants according to the travel modes they used. The upper right corner represents those who use active travel only, walking, cycling, and the bottom left corner is those who used only cars. And more than 60% of people in Victoria are dependent on cars for daily travel. What we need is a transition from this to, well, ideally, active travel and at least mixed travel. And I argue that this problem is urgent because our cities are expanding horizontally. This problem of car dependency can become more serious in the future. So those yellow areas are considered as an urban growth corridor in Melbourne, and this sort of peri-urban development can further increase car dependency. So we need to start working together to advocate for the mobility transition. And we have 5 excellent presenters today, 3 researchers, 1 from government sector and another from advocacy group. And each person will talk about 12 minutes. Then we are going to have a panel discussion about 25 minutes, which will be moderated by Dr. Manoj Chandra-Bose. I wish, well, this title, What Can Disrupt the Status Quo and How Research Can Help, is sort of a wish list. But this panel discussion will be driven by questions from the audience. So please submit your question, including those relevant to a specific talk. Maybe we should go to the first speaker.
Thank you, Takemi. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. My name is Belén Zapata-Yomedi. I am a research fellow at Center for Urban Research at RMIT University. My area of research is on urban planning, transportation, and health impacts of different transportation and urban planning patterns. In this specific study, I will showcase the results for a study that we conducted for Melbourne, assessing the health impacts of shifting car travel to cycling. I'm sure many of you are aware that cycling has many benefits, and just to mention a few, cycling as a mode of transportation is environmentally friendly. It virtually produces no air pollution. It's healthy. People who ride their bikes do physical activity, and physical activity is a risk factor for many chronic diseases and also premature mortality. It's efficient. Cycling takes only a fraction of the road parking space in comparison to the private car, and it's economical. For individuals, it's a lot cheaper to buy a bicycle and operate a bicycle in comparison to the private car, and also for governments in terms of delivering infrastructure, which is more affordable for bikes in comparison to the private car, and also for parking. However, in Australian main cities, cycling as a mode share of transportation is very low. Here, in a comparison with other countries around the world, we observe that only 2% of the trips in Australia are by bicycle. We observe at the bottom of the graph for the Netherlands, this is 27%, and Japan, for example, 12%. It's also interesting to see that in Australia, we observe a lot of inequality in cycling, with only 1% of the trips by females being by bicycle in comparison to 2% for males. Again, at the bottom for the Netherlands, we observe the opposite. More women ride the bicycle for transportation purposes, 28% in comparison to 25%. Melbourne is no exception of Australian cities, with 1.3% according to the Victoria Integrated Survey of Travel and Activity, which is a transport household travel survey. So 1.3% of the trips are by bicycle. And interestingly, a lot of people drive their cars for very short trips. So what I aim to do in this graph is to showcase distance categories and the mode of transportation. At the top left, here we have that 15% of the trips in Melbourne and the 1 kilometre are by car. And 52% of the trips in between 1 and 2 kilometres are by car. The main message here is that we have a great opportunity to increase cycling as a mode of transportation and also walking, because people drive for even very short distances. But of course, we need to have suitable infrastructure to support for this transition. In the study that I'm going to show, we're only assessing the health impacts of what would happen if short trips by car are replaced by walking and cycling, and I will just focus on cycling. Very briefly on the methods, we use simulation modeling because we're modeling the future. We said, what if the Melbourne population in 2017 changed the way they travel? We assess the scenarios. They decrease their car driving, and they increase their cycling and walking. And this impacts on physical activity levels, which is a risk factor for many chronic diseases, including cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, Alzheimer, and depression. And we assess health outcomes. Those outcomes include the number of diseases that could be prevented over time if the Melbournian population changed the transport patterns, the number of deaths that could be prevented from chronic diseases, and also life years and health-adjusted life years. Now, life years means the years that people are alive and contribute to the overall population life years. For example, 5 million people are alive in 2024 in Melbourne. That's 5 million life years that we contribute collectively. But we not only care about how long people live, but also the quality. And we capture this in these health-adjusted life years. Or you might have heard of similar measures called disability-adjusted life years or quality-adjusted life years. We assess the scenarios where we replace all types of trips by car for short distances with cycling or just commuting trips. Those are work-related or education-related. We had a range of scenarios And here I'm just going to focus on cycling, of replacing trips under 2 kilometers by car with cycling and under 5. I just draw your attention to one of these graphs here on the left, which in the master color bar shows the proportion of trips by car in the base case. We do nothing, so 63% of the trips by car. Now, if all type of trips under 2 kilometers are now by bicycle and they were by car, that means car as a transport share drops to 52%. And if only commute trips are replaced, the decrease in car mode share is smaller to 61.7%. Cycling would increase considerably from 1.3% in the baseline to 12% or 2.5%, depending on the type of trips that we replace. Now, 12% of cycling as transport share is what we observe in Japan, as an example. The next scenario is quite extreme, trips under 5 kilometers, and we would see an increase in cycling as transport share to 29% for all type of trips. This seems very extreme, but for the Netherlands, we observe 26% of cycling as a mode share. So some countries are near that number. Our aim was to assess health impacts. So the first thing that we did is to say, well, how would this increase in cycling would contribute to people achieving the physical activity guidelines, which say that we should do at least 150 minutes of physical activity, and this is moderate physical activity per week, distributed amongst more days, or less, but of high intensity physical activity. For example, at base case, we see 53% of the people in Melbourne, and this is just adults, meet the physical activity guidelines. But if all trips by car under 2 kilometers were replaced with cycling, that would increase to 59%. And you can see the rest of the figures in the slide. In terms of life years, the gains could be significant. Again, the Melbourne population moves over the years until everyone dies. It's a closed cohort study. We would see gains in 314,000 life years and 3,092,000 life years. In plain language, this means we would be increasing life expectancy. These scenarios also imply a decrease in the number of people who would die from preventable causes of death, and that's chronic diseases, with the main gains for cardiovascular diseases at the bottom of the graph, stroke and ischemic heart disease. For example, we would see for the 2 kilometers scenario, a reduction or death prevented from ischemic heart disease as the main cause of death of 10,000. And also we would see important benefits for Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. So this is death. We would also prevent a lot of diseases, and this is important because once people get chronic diseases, this is a major burden in the healthcare system. So we would see important gains for, again, cardiovascular diseases. For example, 20,000 cases of ischemic heart disease could be prevented in the 2 kilometers scenario. And also here, diabetes could be reduced. Now, this is a large study, and if you want to look at all the results, we have a publication, and the details are in the top in the slide. And also, we develop an online visualization where we not only show results for Melbourne, but similar study that we conducted for Brisbane. And you can find these studies in the portal of the Australian Urban Observatory. So I invite you to explore more results. The main strength from our studies, specifically for Melbourne, we believe this is the first study assessing this type of health outcomes in relation to active transportation. We use the latest evidence available for the link of physical activity and chronic diseases. And we use methods that allow us to model individuals' trajectories in terms of the physical activity. And also we include trends in our modeling, which approximates that better to modeling the future, which is what we intend to do. Now, it's a modeling study, a lot of uncertainty around the inputs. We cannot fully predict the future, just based on the data that's available to us. And our heterogeneity is limited to age and sex. So we did not model socioeconomic differences, which I believe would make a significant impact on the result as well. And it's important to model to see who would benefit the most from policy shifting car travel to active modes. Now, this is all about cycling and transitioning from car driving. So we aim to generate evidence to support this cause and support local policies specific to Melbourne. We have the 20-minute neighbourhood, cycling corridors, all aiming at reducing car travel and supporting walking and cycling. And we also argue that any policies that aim to increase walking and cycling as mode of transportations should be gender and age related as well. So everyone benefits and everyone is catered for. I would like to acknowledge the multiple funders along the way to produce these results. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very comprehensive study and a scenario-based study on replacing short car trips to cycling. Our next speaker is Mr. Firas Mohammed, who is focusing on a bit more focus on the proportion of short car trips that can be recycled. Can you do a brief introduction, if that's okay with you?
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. As Takina mentioned, my name is Firas and I'm a PhD candidate in the Healthy Cities team at the Center for Urban Transition. And for my PhD thesis, I'm working on developing a bikeability index. And today I'm going to present some empirical data on the proportion of short car trips that can be cycled in Australia. I think Belen also touched on a similar topic which was focused on commuting trips. So I'm going to focus on a different purpose, which is utilitarian trips. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of and the custodians of the land on which we meet today. Thank you, Takemi and Belen, for discussing how serious the car dependency issue is in Australia. So we clearly understand that car dependency could lead to many health, environmental, and economic issues. As mentioned earlier, one of the ways to tackle these issues is to promote active transport. We have two common modes of active transport, walking and cycling. Now, compared to walking, cycling can replace longer car trips and potentially can replace more car trips than walking. The approach to identify the short car trips that can be cycled is first to determine the longest distance that people can normally travel, and then to use that distance as a threshold value to classify car trips which are shorter than that distance as the ones that can be replaced. And this approach has been used in previous studies. For instance, in one of the Australian study, they focused on adolescents not on adults, and they used 4.2 kilometer distance as the threshold value, and they found that 44% of car trips made by adolescents can be replaced because they were shorter than the threshold value. And in another Belgian study, they used 8 kilometers as the threshold value, and they found that 64% of the car trips are shorter than this threshold value. They additionally had some criteria to exclude non-bikeable trips. For instance, one of the criteria was if a trip is made to give someone a ride, they exclude that trip as non-bikeable, since such trips cannot be replaced by cycling. And after all the exclusions, finally they estimated that 10% of the car trips and 2.5% of the distance which was covered in those car trips in car trips could be replaced with cycling. In a recent study conducted by our team, we found that the trip distance that people travel on bicycles significantly vary with trip purpose. For instance, we have for utilitarian trips, we have 1.8 kilometer median distance, and for commuting trips, 3.6 kilometer median trips. So when we consider about replacing car trips with cycling, we have to focus on two types of trip purposes. The first one is utilitarian trips, which involves trips made for shopping or to run an errand or to access services such as health services. And the second type of purpose is commute, which is which includes the trips that are made to access work or education places. And I'm going to focus on utilitarian trips because similar to bicycle trips, utilitarian car trips also involve significantly smaller distances. Therefore, it could be beneficial and more easier to replace utilitarian car trips with cycling. Therefore, in this presentation, I'm presenting an analysis of the car trips that we conducted to identify the proportion of utilitarian car trips that can be cycled. We estimated the proportions in terms of both number of trips and also in terms of the distance covered in those trips. For this analysis, just like balance analysis, we use this Vista data from a different period. So we use the data from 2012 to 2020 in the data set for additional information maybe. The participants were given a 24-hour travel diary to record the details of all the trips that they made on the designated survey day. So in the data set, we had about 60,000 adult participants, and they reported about almost 200,000 trips. And for this analysis, we focused on home-based trips only, because in Australia, generally people can use the bikes which are stations at their residences only. The number of home-based trips in the dataset was about 130,000, and among them, 80,000 were made for utilitarian purposes. Among these 80,000 utilitarian trips, 81% of the trips were made by cars, and only 1% of the trips were made by bicycles. So these are the equations that we use to estimate proportions in terms of frequency and also distance. For considering the time limitation, I'm skipping the detailed explanation of these equations. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to explain them later. So now the most important question is, how did we decide if a car trip can be replaced with a cycling trip? So we used a purpose-specific threshold value for utilitarian purposes. So if we use the 80th percentile distance of home-based trips, which are made for the same purpose, which is utilitarian purposes, and if a car trip is less than this distance, we classify it as a replaceable trip by cycling. So in a recent study, we estimated that for utilitarian purposes, in general, the 80th percentile value is 4 kilometers, and for men it was 4.3, and for women it was 3.4. So if a car trip is shorter than 4 kilometers, we classify it as a trip that can be replaced by cycling. And when we estimated the proportions for specific genders, we use the relevant threshold values. After identifying the car trips that are short enough to be replaced by cycling, we excluded the trips which were reported to be made for accompanying someone or to pick up or picking up or dropping off someone, because these bicycles are not suitable for these types of trips. The final results are presented in this table. So we had about 65,000 utilitarian trips in the data set, and they covered about 581,000 kilometers in distance of these 65,000 trips. And among these 65,000 trips, about 22,000 was identified as trips that can be replaced by cycling, which accounted for 34,000. And these 34,000 trips accounted for 46,000 kilometers in distance, which is 8% of the total trip distance, which were covered in cars. So our findings presents additional evidence that there is still scope in Australia to reduce car dependency and to increase the rate of cycling. We showed that currently about 80% of home-based utilitarian trips are made by cars, and only about 1% of the trips are made by bicycles. So of the car trips, we have almost 1/3 of the trips that can be replaced by cycling trips. And however, the replaceable cycling trips account for just less than 10% of the distance. Therefore, necessary actions need to be taken to promote cycling trips to replace car trips, and also to extend the distance that people can normally travel on bicycles, for improving the bike friendliness of the built environment and promoting e-bikes are two example strategies to achieve both of these goals. The next talk, which is on the barriers and enablers of cycling, will discuss the strategies in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Firas. Okay, next presenter is Roland from Monash.
Am I right to unplug this?
Yep. Good. And as Firas mentioned, she is going to talk about barriers and enablers and barriers to the uptake of cycling for transport.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for having me, Tony. And as introduced, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow. I'm in a group called the Sustainable Mobility and Safety Research Team. We sit within the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine, but we are a little bit weird that we sit there because we're a very transdisciplinary team, pulling from engineering, robotics, social sciences, and political science, all of the things that we need to bring together to solve some of these really complex problems around car dependency and how we get more people using active travel as a part of their everyday lives. My work sitting within that is particularly around gender inequities in bike riding and how we can work to overcome some of those. Today, though, I'm going to be talking more about the work I did during my PhD, which was a program of research looking at how we identify some of the potential for bike riding in Victoria, the barriers and enablers as well. And I'm so sorry to everyone who is not in Victoria, because my work is very Melbourne and Victoria specific, but I would say that a lot of the findings are applicable to other settings as well. So we know, and thank you so much to Belen for introducing this, that despite those really vast health, climate, social and economic benefits of bike riding, participation is quite low in inequitable in both Victoria and Australia-wide, where more than twice as many men ride a bike than women. In order to start planning for that, increasing that participation, we need to understand who's interested in riding, what prevents them and what might encourage them as well. And prior to this work, we had very limited research available on this in Australia. What we did have was very much focused on the needs of and perspectives of those who were already riding a bike. And that was really limiting our ability to understand the needs of people outside of that. And that was really not capturing the needs of women as well. So to understand the barriers and enablers of riding a bike across the state, we conducted a 4-phase program of research, including a systematic review with meta-analysis about the barriers and enablers of cycling for transport globally. We did a statewide survey to map out where people were riding a bike, who was interested and who they were. And we also had a Melbourne-wide survey to quantify those barriers and enablers. And finally, some in-depth interviews with people who were interested in cycling to really unpack more about what those barriers and enablers were, explain why it was that they happened, and identify some potential solutions as well. Today, I'm going to breeze over a little bit of the systematic review and the statewide survey and actually go a bit more into the two studies, which were the last part, and where we were able to make some quite interesting and unplanned comparisons. So to start off with, in our systematic review, we asked the questions, what are the barriers and enablers of cycling for transport in OECD countries? Which seems maybe like quite a simple question, but turned out to be an absolutely massive study. We had 55 papers and reports that were included, identifying 34 barriers and 21 enablers to cycling. On the right, and I know this is incredibly small and I do not expect you to be reading this properly, but this is a forest plot of the different meta-analyses results that we were able to identify within each of the barriers reported. From this, you can get a bit of an idea of the variety and diversity of barriers that people experience and what was reported. But what you can also see is some really quite tight confidence intervals, which are those grey bars. And that really shows where some of these barriers were really consistently highly reported across studies. And those leading barriers reported in the review related to riding a bike alongside motor vehicles, with the top three being concerns around motorist aggression, a lack of high quality bike lanes, and perceived risk of injury. Moving on now to the cycling typology study. So this was a statewide survey, and we knew that for efficient planning and to change your behaviour, which in this case was increasing cycling participation, we needed to quantify and understand some of the characteristics of that near market or our potential riders in an area, and also how this varies across Victoria and within Greater Melbourne as well. One of the ways to do this is by using what we call the Geller typology, which classifies people as either strong and fearless, enthused and confident, interested but concerned, or no way, no how. And while this measure is quite crude in the way that it's calculated, it can serve as a really useful policy tool for actually showing somewhat of a representation of some of the latent demand and interest at a small geographical level. To do this, we conducted an online survey of adults living in local government areas across Greater Melbourne and a selection of regional councils as well, using an online member panel. In Victoria, 85% of our road network is made up of our local roads, and these are managed by local governments. So by having that LGA-specific data, local governments were very much able to make better informed decisions around active transport planning rather than relying on data from other areas, making this quite a useful policy tool. So this map shows where we collected representative samples, so across all of Melbourne, which is in that bluey grey colour, and regional centres in the yellow. So we ended up with a sample of 3,999 people and representative samples across Greater Melbourne and within individual LGAs, which we're really happy about. What we did find for the Geller typologies was really quite surprising and really quite interesting. Previously, in our previous policy documents, we relied on 60% being the number for our interested but concerned, but that was actually pulled from a study that was conducted in Portland, USA. And that was also not a study, but it was also just an estimation of the amount of people who would likely be interested within that area. So it was really, really quite heartening to see that that interesting but concerned group actually made up the great majority of people in this sample. So it was 78.2%. No way, no how was at that 15.7. Strong and fearless and enthused and confident, quite low, around that 3% mark. And this was really interesting because that interested but concerned group are those people who want to be riding a bike. It's something they're wanting to be integrating into their everyday lives, but only in infrastructure that separates people from motor vehicle traffic. This shows us the proportion of participants who were interested but concerned across all LGAs in Greater Melbourne, where the darker areas have more people classified as interested but concerned and the lighter areas have less. what we really see here is not that usual pattern that we would usually expect where it's clustered around the city, but instead we have these areas on the fringe of Greater Melbourne with that very high interest in cycling. And even in the lighter areas on the map, it's also important to note that the group still made up at least 65% of the population within that LGA. So some really quite big, large potential. What was also really great to see is that interest in cycling was comparable between women and men, despite substantially lower participation for women. So 78% of women in the study were classified as interested but concerned. So we knew then, okay, we have this huge potential for increasing cycling in Melbourne. What is stopping people? What is going to encourage them? We also knew from speaking with other local councils and other actors in the area that this was so important to be able to quantify and prioritise some of these barriers and enablers in order for them to develop and fund potential campaigns and policy. Knowing this, we developed an online survey with an aim to quantify the prevalence of barriers and enablers of cycling in Greater Melbourne. So through the previous systematic review that we conducted, we found that there were really two ways to ask about barriers and enablers in a quantitative way, and both provided some really good and useful insight, and we wanted to be able to integrate both of them into our survey. The two ways were to simply ask people to tick which barriers applied to them, and that gave us the size of the problem, as we can see on the left of the screen. And the second way, which we can see on the right of the screen, is to say, okay, how much of a barrier is this to you? We wanted to capture both dimensions of this data. So within our survey design, we asked people to tick all that apply, and then those factors that they were selected then went through for them to rate how much it deterred them or how much it enabled them. Another thing which I'll go through quickly considering the time, but something else that was quite important that we found in the systematic review was just how important language was in how we ask some of these questions, particularly around safety. In the systematic review, we found a number of studies which talked about feelings of safety being a barrier to bike riding. And I'm sure that a lot of us will know that if you do find that that is the top barrier to riding a bike, there's not really much that you can do with that finding. You don't really know what particular parts of safety they're concerned about. And we also saw through the systematic review that different people interpreted that question in different ways, and it often became quite gendered. We saw that some people interpreted it as, okay, safety in terms of my concern for injury, whether that's through falling from my bike or through collision, whereas other people thought more so about their personal safety, so a concern about theft or experiencing violence or harassment. In the survey, we also used that Geller typology tool, or the 4 types of cyclist tool, to categorise people as the 4 groups that I introduced earlier. And following the survey, we interviewed 40 people across Greater Melbourne who were classified as interested but concerned. And we interviewed 20 women and 20 men to really deep dive on some of those barriers and enablers and identify some potential solutions as well. So what did we find? We had 717 people complete the survey, and this chart shows us the proportion of people who reported particular barriers to riding a bike for transport purposes specifically. So the 3 different colours show that second dimension of the data, where the lightest blue is where it somewhat deterred them, and the darkest blue is where it completely deters them from riding a bike. We can see even just in those top 4 barriers, there 3 of those were concerns about riding on the road alongside motor vehicle traffic and the potential for injury. And for those that reported those factors, most indicated that it completely deterred them from riding. Moving on to the enablers of riding a bike for transport, and we saw really quite similar results. Nearly 66% of the sample reported that having a bike lane separated from traffic was an enabling factor, and 80% of those noted that it encouraged them very much. Now, when we stratified this by gender, that was where it got really quite interesting. So This shows us the barriers of riding a bike, where the proportion of women who reported particular barriers are shown in blue and men are shown in the yellowy orange colour. And the green boxes show where there are statistically significant differences. And what we can see in these charts is how many more women reported concerns around riding on the road alongside motor vehicle traffic and those associated concerns compared to men. And these were particularly concerns around falling from their bike and also feeling like they weren't physically fit enough as well. When we brought in our interview findings, this is when it got really interesting. We saw that exclusively women reported concerns around a lack of confidence in purchase, repair and riding, a concern about falling from their bike and into oncoming motor vehicle traffic, and a concern about having to ride their bike through areas where lighting was turned off after hours. And this was a real concern because we know that a lot of our off-road bike paths where women are more likely to feel comfortable, these often detour along rivers, coasts, through parks and other areas where that natural surveillance is limited, and lighting is often turned off after hours. Bringing this all together, we know that we have huge potential for increased bike riding in Victoria, demonstrated by that 78% interested but concerned. We consistently saw across studies and population groups some very common themes, that the most commonly reported barriers and enablers really related to that need for separation of people riding bikes from people who were driving cars. This is really important because we know that 99% of all of our bike infrastructure in Melbourne is on road. Of course, we found substantial gender differences, where significantly more women reported concerns around riding on the road alongside motor vehicle traffic and reported these additional barriers as well to do with lack of lighting, lack of confidence in very male-dominated environments, and a fear of falling from their bike as well. Now that we know all this, it really brings into question, are we designing safe spaces for people of all ages and abilities, or are we designing spaces for the people who are already confidently riding a bike? In terms of next steps, we were able to identify some key equity deserving groups through this research that wanted to ride a bike but had limited access to doing so. We heard through this research they don't have information that they feel is accessible, inclusive and practical to be supportive of them to be able to actually use active and sustainable transport in their everyday lives. I think this is really demonstrated in the picture on the right, which is the first article that appears if you type starting to ride a bike help into Google. You do not need padded cycling shorts to hop on a bike. You actually just need a bike, maybe a helmet and a lock as well. My work now is very much around how we can empower some of these equity deserving groups by co-designing interventions that will actually support their needs for riding a bike. One of my next projects is a collaboration between myself, Ben Beck, Nicole Calms and Professor Helen Skatiris, where we've partnered with 3 local councils across Greater Melbourne to co-design a suite of behaviour change interventions to be able to support young women, particularly in these areas, to be able to ride bikes. All going to plan, we'll be able to present some of these findings in about October, September 2024. So please stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Lauren. Very good to hear that you have now a new project coming up.
Yeah.
Next speaker is Henry from Western Australia, and he has an interesting career path. He's currently working in Western Australian government, I think, but he used to be, or maybe still is, a researcher at the university sector. But anyway, Tepi, floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, still an academic, but also working in government. But I'm here today representing myself, and just a quick disclaimer, not talking on behalf of government. But yeah, what gets advocated for gets done is what I'm going to talk about. So we've heard so much there about a massive body of accumulated evidence particularly, you know, some of the systematic review evidence there that Lauren was presenting on the barriers. We know a lot. So I suppose my presentation is how do we use that evidence? And I think that will flow really nicely into our final speaker, Stephen Hodge from We Ride Australia. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk a little bit about what advocacy is, but also message framing and how important I think that is for everyone to be across. A little bit of a case study of the 3 transport priorities, and then finally some rapid fire key learnings. So what is advocacy? So it's a term that we hear a lot, but often, sometimes just grappling with what it is. So here's Stephen in Parliament. Here's one example of policy, of advocacy, but of course, there's many different types of advocacy. It can be broadly summarized as mobilizing influence to bring about change. So doing things together or as an individual. So here's a slightly more detailed definition. We all are advocates, is my belief. And so understanding what advocacy is and how we contribute to the agenda is really, really important. So it's those individual and social actions. So either mainly stuff we do together, designed to gain support for a particular goal or program. The reason why I wanted to introduce that is because it's very much for academics related to research impact, knowledge translation, but then also it is related to things like activism and lobbying. And this is all about ensuring that the rigorous evidence that is produced by academics is part of that policy making journey and picture. So yes, it's to influence the policymaking process, and hopefully it's to act on those key points in the whole picture that make the biggest difference. And I think when I come on to talking about message framing in a second, we'll see why that's so important, that we are advocating for things that have a big impact. But a bit more about advocacy. I think it's nice to have a bit of a grounding and go back to the kind of basics. Yeah, so I said before, we can and all should learn to be better advocates. And this is a continuous journey. We all get better at it, but it's really vital if we want our evidence to be used, and working together is a key part of advocacy. So things like this, organising Takimi, Manoj, this is brilliant because this helps us to collaborate and share. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion at the end. But let me start by kind of introducing this advocacy framework. So this is just one example of an advocacy framework. We're really familiar with, as academics, producing the evidence, but actually going from the evidence to how do we use that? How does it all work? This is a really nice conceptualization by Trevor Shilton. So it's around taking evidence, but presenting it as policy relevant. So it might be some transport research might be feeding into the congestion agenda, or the air pollution agenda, or the global warming agenda. When we're talking about solutions, they're obviously informed by evidence of what works, of what people want, what is cost effective. There's many ways that we can kind of prioritize solutions. But I pause at this moment and say, the reason why I think advocacy is so important and getting together and doing things like this is if we asked everyone on this call right now, what are the 4 actions that Australia needs to do to make a massive dent and impact into increasing walking and riding and reducing car dependency, I think we'd all come up with quite different 4 solutions at the moment. And I think as we mature and come together and work together, we start to refine these solutions and all agree on kind of the top level solutions that we need to advocate for. So I think that's a continuous journey. So it's obviously framed as quite linear, but this is very iterative. Doing things together is so vital, and partnerships and coalitions, the power of a shared voice, particularly across different sectors. So we're talking about car dependency today, so it's kind of more transport, but we've heard a bit about trip distance, so that's kind of more urban design. We've also got the health agenda and the public health. So that's my background from the kind of public health and physical activity side of things. So it's really important that we have cross-cutting solutions across those different agendas. There are multiple ways we can be advocates, and it's not just the political, it's not just Stephen in his suit in Parliament waving around and getting people mobilised in Parliament. It's at every level. So this is something that we can all do. We can all play a role in. I think as academics particularly is around putting out our evidence in formats that can be digested and understood. And there's rich detail in journal articles, but there's many ways that we can do knowledge translation to help transition that knowledge out of those journal articles. It's media, it's professional mobilization, as like we are today, all coming together as professionals. It's community, and I think this is a really important one for Australia around mobilizing some of our bicycle user groups, some of our walking and cycling advocacy bodies to come together. So the Better Streets is an example of that nationally, but also advocacy from within organizations. So we can all be advocacy in our own organizations too. And finally, it's both an art and a science. And we know this, Stephen's going to talk a little bit about the kind of dark arts in inverted commas of advocacy, but there is a science to it and there is an art to it. I think part of the art can be explained by message framing, and I think this is something I'd just like to spend a little bit of time on. So if I kind of start with a few that we're probably familiar with on this call, accident versus crash. Okay, we should probably be using crash because that implies, that it's fixable. Accident implies it's inevitable. Yeah, we've probably heard of that one. Perhaps it's people walking versus pedestrians, so it kind of humanizes the behavior. These are things that, it's very easy to slip into using terms like pedestrians when talking with, friends, family, and these things are important. Low traffic neighborhood and 20-minute neighborhoods, 15-minute neighborhoods versus maybe high access neighborhood. So maybe it's about, these are just examples, of course. Here's one that comes up quite a lot, at least in my world in physical activity, is there's no single solution. And I've certainly been guilty of this one in saying no single solution, no single solution, rather than framing it as here are some prioritized solutions. Or a prioritized solution. And I think it's about advocating for actions that are big enough in and of themselves to make a difference. So it's not to say the others aren't important, but I wouldn't be banging the drum for them. I think an example of something like that is Road Safety Week and asking people to make pledges to drive safer is kind of one of those deprioritized solutions in my eyes. And really, we should be advocating for those more structural issues. I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of a discussion around that in the panel, hopefully, see where people fit. This is one I'm kind of grappling with at the moment, related to the last point. Are we promoting multiple low impact solutions a bit too much? And maybe we need to go up a few levels to those higher impact solutions. If people haven't heard of this book or just seen it a couple of times, I highly recommend it. I've just finished reading it. There's some really good stuff in here. 9 devious frames used by industry to frame road safety in there, but I think it's a cross-industry playbook, so it applies to car dependency, it applies to obesity, physical activity. So go and take a read of those. They were really interesting further reading for message framing. Take a moment to pause and kind of go, all right, so that was quite a lot in there. This is an example of a piece of advocacy work that was done together. And just want to highlight some of the strengths of it to show that it can be done and we can bring it together. So the 3 transport priorities, if you haven't heard of it, was prepared for the 2022 federal election by the Asia Pacific Society for Physical Activity in partnership with We Ride Australia. And there were several benefits to this, and I'll highlight those here. So yes, it was research informed, but I think it was also politics informed. So it had high level of clarity on the asks. So 3 asks, and you can see them on the right-hand side there. But they were also positioned to be aligned to current government priorities around tackling the climate agenda and global warming, around air pollution, congestion. So really positioning why we want these transport priorities. It had multi-sector support, so you can see the partnerships there across public health, education, and several other organisations. And finally, received some media attention and actually made it to Parliament. So this was an example and kind of a bit of a snapshot in time of the 3 transport priorities, but it built on many years of advocacy by We Ride Australia. So this is a long game. And that probably leads me nicely into some other key learnings around advocacy. So it's a long game, but that doesn't mean that we can't play in the short term as well. So I think everyone has a role. Partnerships and relationship building is really, really vital. And for academics, I feel that that is presenting research in a way that we can engage and doing things like this today, and presenting evidence in a format that's usable for people. It's really important to capture the media and public sentiment and to take them on a journey too with our research. So, you know, we know a lot about barriers, we know a lot about enablers, and the way we translate that into media and public sentiment and sharing it is really important so that the public understands it. Public do have a really good understanding, and they really, as Lauren said, want to walk and cycle more. So ensuring that we don't repeat frames that people aren't familiar with. For researchers, it's designing research questions in partnership with evidence users. We know from policy research, public policy research, if people haven't engaged in that as an academic, I think it's really worthwhile delving into that field and getting across it. One example is policy windows and timing and the importance of playing that long game so that we've got solutions ready to present. For academics developing interventions in walking and cycling, I think scalability assessments can be really helpful. And if you haven't heard of that, it's really worth a bit of a Google. Research impact and knowledge translation. These are things that funders of research grants are, as we know, are ever becoming more prevalent, and it becomes more important to do so. So advocacy plays into this. We are all advocates, said that a few times. Community advocacy is as important as expert organizational advocacy. So we need to bring the community on the journey. So working together within our own local communities is vital. Repeating the same message and using killer facts. So we've heard a lot of information today, but if we were to use one stat, one grab, which one would it be? Repeat the same message regularly. Celebrate the little wins and build momentum is a strong advocacy strategy to bring people on the journey. Use human language. And finally, I will pop these resources into the Q&A as links, but these are some really useful further readings that kind of have been really interesting, recent reading for me and recent professional development. So just go and check those out if you can get time. My final key take home is that we all have a role working together to ensure research is usable and used in transport and reducing car dependency. Thank you.
Thank you, Tepi. Well, good to see all those important tips to be an advocate. Next speaker is Stephen. Stephen helped us to develop our seminar program. Thank you, Stephen. And our subtitle for our seminar was Research Evidence for Advocacy. But Stephen insisted he will talk about, it's not about evidence for advocacy, but evidence versus advocacy. So that's what he's going to talk about. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Takemi, and I'm hoping that you can all see my presentation.
Yes.
Now, bless Tepi, he's young and enthusiastic and very positive. I'm going to take a deliberately contrarian view here, and I'm going to say evidence, schmevidence. You know, we spend months and years working on building an evidence base, you know, that addresses disadvantage and equity, and then we wonder why we aren't getting more traction in the policies and investments that get delivered on the ground. So I want to start off by just, you know, when there's no apparent link between what we understand is the right thing to do and based on research evidence and the actual outcomes, well, you know, clearly not everyone agrees with us. Why not?
Stephen,
Yeah,
did you want to
sorry.
put it on presenter mode?
Yeah, sorry, I realised I thought I'd done that, and that's where we are. Okay. There are several reasons for this. The minister may not agree with us and their government may not agree with us and have no policy position which supports what we want. The minister may agree with us, but their team may not. And by team, I mean their department and their advisors. The minister and the department may be on our side, but then each department or line agency has to go through Prime Minister and Cabinet where all of their programs get assessed, moves on then, if it gets through that, to the Expenditure Review Committee and Cabinet for approval. You know, and all ministers have to fight for a limited funding available in a budget. Okay, the minister, the government, the department and cabinet may all agree with us, but public opinion could be against it. Tepi's talked about this, but given that a government only gets to make decisions if they're in office, you can see where the problems are going to start there. And lastly, the government may not agree with us, and it seems like it, if it does, and it seems like it might pass the public the pub test in public, but they may not have the balance of power and they may have to go to independents, crossbench, or the opposition. And the secret is to navigate all of this and figure out how to maximise our ability to make a difference. So firstly, you know, the minister and government, apart from the difficulty of actually getting a meeting with a minister or their staff, you know, once you get into their office, you sometimes just have a few minutes to make your case. You know, division in the House or a breaking issue can have them leave at a moment's notice. You know, you have to understand exactly how your proposal can fit into their government policies and priorities. But ideally, you can figure out how to make it a win-win and not wasting their time by asking for the politically impossible. In recent times, you know, a lot of the research that we've been leveraging has focused on the health benefits of a better urban environment and when active transport is easier to choose. Of course, while this continues to be a major benefit, the focus on the current government, of course, is this transition to net zero. So we're flipping, you know, to some extent, our focus to have climate transition and net zero transport much higher up. How much will it cost? Who pays? You know, is it a measure that could be funded from an existing program? You know, these are all things that you really have to do your homework on. Is it something the minister feels they should not be paying for? You know, this active transport in particular is problematic because delivery is undertaken by state and councils, not generally federal government. So you need to understand what's within their scope of responsibility, and that's probably the single biggest issue that we face for cycling and active transport. But we need to find out what the feds can do to shift the dial. Can it assume a big enough percentage of the passenger transport task to help transport transition to net zero? Now, we think so, but we need a few more tools or research on the cost of mode shift to get us there. Is it something the minister feels, I've said that, should not be paying for? This is, obviously we bring up some of the benefits in our economic reporting that we present to government about that climate stuff. International experience would seem to indicate that the economics are pretty clear about why you would invest in active transport. China is not leading globally on this for any other reason other than the economic arguments. But this getting across this understanding is a big issue for us with the federal government. Secondly, let's talk about the bureaucrats in the departments. Now, this is the engine room of policy and programs for the government, right? They're the ones that will pick your data apart and may be skeptical or excited by your findings. They can't make it happen generally if the minister doesn't want it, but they can certainly give it a crack. But they can also be a significant barrier if they do not see the benefits. So the departmental bureaucrats are generally very knowledgeable and interested, and it's vital to engage with them, and they'll often help you understand what the issues are from their side. Thirdly, the minister themselves has to get their projects, like I mentioned before, through the PM's department and the Expenditure Review Committee to Cabinet. I mentioned that the Prime Minister and Cabinet has teams that individually assess, each, like infrastructure and transport, have a couple of teams that review the projects. They're not public facing. They're only there to liaise with the line agencies, with the departments, and provide their advice to the Prime Minister's office, the PMO. If all that goes well, then the minister has to invest an awful lot of their time and energy and their credibility in a way with their colleagues to fight for a new program around the cabinet table. So no one should underestimate the difficulty of getting a new program up, or even just of maintaining the programs that exist. So before you start the process, of course, we've talked about, public opinion. You need to demonstrate to decision makers that there is support for your initiative, and you need to think about how to show the public that the public supports it too. Now, this could be, as Tebi said, line up the entire research or industry sector to speak with one voice. It could be that you need to get positive media or do polling to demonstrate public support, or it could mean you need to advertise. Really interestingly, last night on TV, I saw an ad that surprised me. The Minerals Council was advertising to tell us all that the contribution they make to the national economy is huge, that it's billions of dollars they pay in tax and in royalties that all stay in Australia. Now, they clearly believe that in the face of this focus on renewables, some negative media on coal and mining, but also the new opportunities with the government investing in the critical minerals industry and processing in Australia, that they need to mark to the general public. They've been putting out media releases to tell their story. Really illustrates that even one of our major industry sectors feel it needs to continuously build public support, which translates into political license for them as a sector when investment decisions are being made by politicians. So advertising and content creation, incredibly powerful tool. Sadly, the cost is beyond people like us to commission. Our focus, we do things like we focus on kids as a Trojan horse, riding to school, just like the 3 transport priorities. We have a program being trialled on the Sunshine Coast, but no shock jock can take you to task for saying that children should be able to walk and ride to school. Options like the UK's Bike is Best program, could work here. Again, it's still a significant undertaking and needs a lot of funding. So in terms of what strategy we use, advocacy, professional PR, lobbying, and deploying research and evidence is actually very cost effective, relatively speaking, for fighting for the decisions that we want governments to make in our favour. Which brings me to my last point. Working with a balance of power, crossbenchers. In Parliament, there are 151 members of Parliament and 76 senators. There are an enormous range of interests, concerns, and life experiences across the House. You simply never know who will be a future minister or PM even when you're dealing with backbenchers. So until you talk to them, also you have no idea if they're interested in your expertise and research. Now, I started a writing group for Polly's more than 15 years ago. In that time, I've had new MPs come into the House and ride with us who ended up being senior ministers, and even a few PM Prime Ministers have ridden with us over the years. So Tepi says it's a long game. Here's some evidence. We've got a great platform, that we built over years for reaching backbench MPs, the Parliamentary Friends of Cycling Group. You can do regular events where you bring particular issues to the notice of MPs, and the benefit for Australians when we can choose to ride a bike more easily. And the very last thing I want to say is that research evidence is nothing without being able to tell the story about why it matters to humans. Actually showing that a fantastic street for people and how much everyone loves it. Showing the boys suffering disability from a meningococcal disease who's now able to ride to school, showing a mum on a cargo bike taking her kids to school, or a ride to school program, which both the parents and the kids love. We just have to get better at telling our stories. Thanks a lot. Let's escape out of that. You can grab me back. I will stop sharing, and we are,
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good to see your contact in Canberra. Now we have about 15 minutes plus for our panel discussion, and this will be moderated by Manoj. So do you see questions from the audience?
Yeah, and first of all, thanks to all the presenters. I think we had a very nice flow of the discussion from the first and from the health impacts of switching from car dependency to active transport, and Firas, Lauren, and thanks to Tepi and Steve. So we have some questions here in the Q&A, but what I would like to do now is because there are a number of questions. So you can raise your hand on the Teams platform, and you can directly ask the questions to the presenters. You can specify the name of the presenter and ask the questions, so that we can facilitate the one-to-one conversation. So, or if not, I can read this Q&A, the questions put in the Q&A window.
Can I ask? Sorry.
Yeah. So maybe we start with Christian. Yep. I will unmute you.
So I am a day-to-day manager for a Youth for Planet initiative here in Europe. We're global. We cycle to UN COP meetings. We cycle around Europe to gather narratives. Stephen's point about great data, great research means nothing if you can't tell your story. So I'm curious, who do you have at the advocacy level that, like Tepi was referring to often, and Sarah was referring to, like nibbling at that cheese? Who do you have in Australia collecting these great narratives in a way that stitches them together and then releases them as part of a multimedia sort of day-to-day campaign to really reverse the dark arts PR machine?
Except that we might benefit from the dark arts ourselves, but you mean, so do we have an equivalent of a street films or something like that? That we, I think all of us at various times have tried at a fairly low level. It requires quite significant deployment of resources. We're not able to do that. We do short videos, that we post in a bit of an ad hoc way. So, but that is was crying out for action. I'm not sure, Tepi, or if you or anyone else has any thoughts on this.
Yeah, so we've got Better Streets as well as a fairly new kind of grassroots organisation, but again, not to the same level as something like a street films level, where it's that consistent. I think it's a vital missing piece. Almost like what Stephen was saying about the bike is best, kind of to bring the public along on the journey. Yeah. But it's then interesting, just in devil's advocate to that, is reading the Dark PR book, and that is one of the silver boomerangs is the mass media. But I think that on balance, I think we do need to bring the public along the journey, and I think a mass media campaign is a good next step. Yeah.
Great. Maybe we can have one question here. Takemi.
Thanks, Manoj. Well, one worry I have about cycling promotion is it might expand socio-economic inequalities between low SES, high ESS. If people in affluent areas are more keen to engage in cycling and start cycling. And perhaps Lauren would be a good person to answer this question. She may be prepared, but how this can be prevented in cycling promotion?
Excellent question. And I would be prepared if I had my slides up, but I've gotten out of it, but that's okay. So we know that interest in riding, why we would typically see it clustered around the CBD where we see more of those affluent areas, we actually see the complete flip in Greater Melbourne. So we see the highest interest in riding a bike is actually in our outer urban areas, so that peri-urban fringe. But these are our areas that have the lowest access to cycling infrastructure that makes them feel safe and enables them to be able to participate in this kind of activity. So that's why taking such a equity-centred approach in how it is that we not only deliver cycling infrastructure in terms of protected infrastructure, but also lower speed limits and also behaviour change programs as well. So that's why, as a part of my work, it's targeting some of those equity deserving groups that have that very high interest in riding, but very low participation. One of those that I mentioned was young women. We saw that 4 in 5 young women in Victoria are interested in riding. So some of the highest participation that we saw within these subgroups, but participation was 4 times lower than men of the same age. So incredibly low participation, as well as they have this, it's a real key travel behaviour change time. They are leaving school, heading to university, going to TAFE, starting new jobs, potentially moving out of home, making these dramatic shifts where we know that their travel behaviour is going to change, whether we can then introduce to them this is a feasible way for you to be able to get around. And we know that they're trying to source that information now and they're not finding information that's accessible for them. So absolutely, I think that is the way forward for all of our research and everything that it is that we do. It needs to have that equity approach so that we don't continue to perpetuate these ongoing inequities that we face.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Very promising to hear that they are interested in engaging in cycling. Thank you. Thank you, Lauren.
Yes, hi. I'm Cameron Taylor. I'm the Sustainability Program Manager at Swinburne. It's in the operational department. Mainly focused on being carbon neutral next year and energy efficiency, a bit of waste. I don't think we have anything active around cycling at all. I was looking at Google Earth during this and Google Maps. The lack of bike lanes or anything near our campus is extraordinary. In fact, there's not one dedicated bike lane anywhere near our entire campus. Now, there was a number about infrastructure. My son's a bit of a transport activist, and he tells me that paint on a road is considered infrastructure, like a line is considered infrastructure in Australia. If you look at Glenferrie Road, there is a line and it has a bike painted on one side of it, but it's also the parking spot for cars. So it's only when the clearway is active that it becomes a useful bike lane, and then it's 2 lanes of traffic and not one. It's actually safer when it's not a clear way and there's cars parked and you've got a little gap. But I guess, you know, in terms of that perception of road safety, until we get a really good way of just getting that line marking working, because we're not going to get separate bike lanes on every road. I don't know what my question is, but it's, you know, local governments control some roads, state governments control other roads, Vic roads control the templates and of line markings. It's just like the templates aren't working. You can have a bike lane where I live in Reservoir in the main shopping centre and it's 50 centimetres wide. It's the gap between the maximum lane for the car, the parking, and it's the bit left over. Do you see just better guidance on infrastructure, including painting, as part of this? Because to me, it's the line marking. And as soon as it gets to an intersection, it goes dot, the solid line goes dot, 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 a diagonal runs into the gutter, and then it disappears. And right where you need that conflict management, which is where one lane becomes 3, 2 turning and 1 goes straight, and the bike lanes disappeared 30 metres before. And so for the confident bike rider, it's a tussle with the cars to get to the front. For the non-confident bike rider, it's just not an option.
Maybe I'll have a quick crack at that and let other people. So, yeah, I mean, clearly, paint on road doesn't meet the needs of the people that are responding to Lauren's surveys, and that also showed up in our Australian Cycling Economy report. We're looking into trying to entice the federal minister to endorse, you know, the global NACTO guide, for example. We know that states have developed their own guides, so but there's no national sort of approach to guidelines. That would also work well in a positive provisioning scenario where we hope one day that the federal minister would say to the states, I'm giving out $10 billion a year for major transport projects. If you don't incorporate consideration of active transport within those projects, you won't get the money. And to tell you how to do it, here is the sort of the guideline you have to follow. That's kind of strategically how we're thinking about this thing. You know, it's been quite transformational through North America and now more broadly around the world. The NACTO guides have really been the codes, the source code for many of the guides that are being developed, even here in Australia.
Thanks, Steve. I think given our time constraint, I think we have about 5-6 minutes more, but we can ask another 2-3 questions. So there are 2 people raising hands, and also there are a number of questions. And I would also like to thank the people who have given some information, additionally putting some links, useful, so people can have a look around here, and we will also share the recordings. But first of all, I can request Alex. There.
Alex Dyer?
Yeah.
Kia ora from New Zealand, everyone. I'm Alex Dyer. I'm chair of Cycling Action Network, and I'm currently covering for Patrick Morgan as the project manager for Cycling Advocacy here in New Zealand. I guess my question, I'm really interested in the health angle, but more to do with the cross sector impact of health, as I really feel strongly that the real power comes when we're not centering cycling. It comes when we're centering people, and we're centering harm done to other people by their mobility activities. So I'm just wondering if, like all of the people lots of you have touched on the health and safety sides of things. I'm really interested if many people are thinking in terms of projected harm or secondary harm of mobility, because that's where I feel like our societies have made a lot of progress to do with smoking, and I feel strongly that our mobility challenges need a similar intervention as we've seen with smoking, and I'm just keen on evaluating how our mobility systems are doing based on how much someone's activity is harming others, as opposed to the benefits for the consumer, as it were, which is what a lot of our talk about cycling kind of comes back to, and I think that that's not as powerful as how much harm you're doing to others by driving. So just some thoughts on that from any of the presenters. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. Yes, this is something that gets brought up to us often about the harms of car dependency and modeling a scenario to demonstrating the impacts in terms of road injuries, air pollution. So in some other studies, we do assess, for example, the harms from road injuries and pedestrians and cyclists are vulnerable road users. So in the case of painted bike lanes, that's quite problematic because the individuals are very exposed to injuries and death when they ride the bikes, but also to air pollution. And we do demonstrate that in other work. And it's a big issue. For example, in Australia, while air pollution is low, as a pedestrian, more so as a cyclist, your exposure is very high because you're doing physical activity amongst cars. So yeah, you get health benefits from physical activity, but the fact that you're surrounded by cars is quite harmful. So we have not focused necessarily on the damage of building the highways, but it is possible. And I mean, that evidence might not come very clear, but we know the transport sector is an important source of emissions, and emissions are problematic for public health. So maybe we need to reframe our messaging and not so much just on physical activity and public health benefits, but harms might be more impactful.
That's interesting.
One more thing to share. I couldn't make the Q&A work. I wanted to share a link for anyone listening or anyone on this call to my public wiki on reducing car dependency. If anybody hasn't seen that, you can find it at bit.ly/break-car-culture. Thank you.
Hopefully we can reach out to you. Thanks, Alex. And hopefully one more question from Cameron Hoffman.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Mainly a question, I guess, for Stephen, with where to target the federal advocacy, and I did ask a question in the post whether abolishing fringe benefits tax on active and public transport costs is probably the potentially an easy, elegant thing for the federal government to do. So that's firstly in terms of an action, and in terms of targeting. We said health, net zero. I've been using the affordable housing crisis, cost of living crisis. Mobility doesn't seem to get a mention in that, but as soon as you frame affordable housing as affordable living, and you do include the cost of transport and indeed energy, suddenly your mobility costs come into fray. And then I do a whole lot of stats about just how much it costs you to own cars and operate, and indeed sell an excess car, invest the savings over 30 years in your loan sort of thing. You save hundreds of thousands of dollars. So nothing more effective.
Yeah. Okay. Look. So yeah, there are some developers and some groups engaged with some developers putting in bike share schemes in social housing. There's some projects in Melbourne underway with Cola Bike. The FBT is a no-brainer. We've done events in Parliament talking about that. We have made that a central tenet of our advocacy. We missed out. Chris Bowen wouldn't have a bar of it attached onto the EV legislation, which was the obvious place for it to go. And some of the independents were very upset that they couldn't either figure out how to get it in. So it takes a whole new piece of legislation now. So it's a little bit harder, but incentives, we did modelling that's been used by the Tasmanian government. It's been used by 2 councils in South Australia to bring in their own schemes, e-bike schemes. And yeah, definitely central to all what we do because it's a no-brainer. It's relatively cheap, relatively small revenue foregone for the government.
Yeah, I guess the other point was capturing the wicked problem of affordable housing via the much less wicked problem of reducing, transport costs, primarily private cars.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge focus on that in the States, and I'm sure Christian would tell us if we had time. But we're a little bit behind in this sort of the equity scene. But cycling is a huge response to lack of transport equity and mobility, accessibility.
Sure.
We are almost there, but just one question regarding the distance traveled. So Bart Williams, maybe I can read out the question from the QA window. So have you studied the acceptable distance for people to cycle on e-bikes? It was presented that about 4 kilometers was the distance for bicycles. Also, how was the 4 kilometers decided on, and is it in terms of time it takes to cycle 4 kilometers or something like physical excursion it takes to cycle 4 kilometers?
So, okay, acceptable distance. So we didn't consider e-bikes actually. Like the data that we have is mostly the traditional bikes. We don't have data in the survey about e-bikes. So there are a few trips like which are reported to be like around 50 kilometers. It's possibly by e-bikes, but most we don't have that specific information whether it was made by an e-bike or traditional bike, but most of the ranges is the traditional distance. And then the second part about the 4 kilometer distance, we the distance was taken from one of our previous study, which analyzed the distance that people travel from their home to some other destinations or from the destinations to their homes. So we analyzed those data and we took the 80th percentile distance as the longest distance that people can travel. So it's based on empirical data on the distance that people actually travel from their home to other places.
Thanks, Firas. And I think given our time constraint, I would like to say maybe we need to wrap up in a few minutes. But there are so many questions, and I apologize for the participants who asked the questions, but we are not able to answer. But please feel free to reach out to our the presenters. We will be happy to answer your questions. But really, that's a very interesting conversation. So I would like to hand over to Takemi.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank our presenters today for preparing the talk and participating in panel discussion. And today's seminar is available on recording. I don't know where to look, but
no, yeah, sorry, should I say? So our Center for Urban Transition has a blog link, so we can share the link along with a specific post and the video of this recording with all our attendees and who registered, so you can have a look there. Yeah.
Okay.
And also there are some important resources shared by our participants, so we can share those.
Well, thank you again for joining this seminar, and we look forward to hearing. Well, if you have any response, we look forward to hearing what you think, what your thoughts about what we did today. Thank you, and bye now.
Thank you.